Question 1. To address the challenge of potential undue influence during an environmental site inspection in Alabama, an Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, officer discovers a potential violation of state water quality regulations. The facility manager, upon noticing the officer's observation, immediately offers to provide a private, informal tour of the facility to clarify the situation and suggests a private lunch meeting to discuss the matter further, emphasizing their long-standing positive relationship with the community. What is the most appropriate course of action for the ADEM officer? Option A. Immediately issue a formal citation for the observed violation without further discussion, as the violation is apparent and any further discussion could be perceived as negotiation. Option B. Accept the private tour and informal discussion to gain a better understanding of the facility's operations and the context of the potential violation, believing that building rapport will lead to better compliance. Option C. Politely decline the private tour and informal discussion. Inform the facility manager that all communications and observations will be documented through official channels, and proceed with the inspection according to established ADEM protocols, requesting any relevant documentation through formal means. Option D. Inform the facility manager that the potential violation will be overlooked this time due to their community contributions and the officer's desire to maintain a positive working relationship, with a verbal warning to improve in the future. The correct answer is C. Politely decline the private tour and informal discussion. Inform the facility manager that all communications and observations will be documented through official channels, and proceed with the inspection according to established ADEM protocols, requesting any relevant documentation through formal means. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a regulator's duty to enforce environmental laws and the potential for undue influence or perceived bias from a regulated entity. The Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, officer must navigate this situation with utmost integrity and adherence to administrative law principles. Careful judgment is required to ensure fairness, transparency, and compliance with Alabama's specific administrative procedures. The best professional approach involves meticulously documenting all interactions and communications with the company, strictly adhering to established ADEM protocols for site inspections and enforcement actions, and avoiding any ex parte communications or commitments that could be misconstrued as preferential treatment. This approach is correct because it upholds the principles of due process and equal protection under Alabama law, ensuring that all regulated entities are subject to the same standards and procedures. It also aligns with the ethical obligations of public servants to act impartially and avoid conflicts of interest, as guided by Alabama's administrative regulations and ethical codes for state employees. Maintaining a clear, documented record is crucial for demonstrating the legitimacy of any subsequent enforcement actions and for defending against potential claims of bias or impropriety. An incorrect approach would be to accept the company's offer of a private tour and informal discussion without proper documentation or adherence to established procedures. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the formal channels for communication and inspection, creating an appearance of impropriety and potentially violating Alabama's Administrative Procedure Act's requirements for public records and open meetings. It also risks the officer inadvertently receiving or acting upon information outside of the official record, which could compromise the integrity of the investigation and any subsequent enforcement decisions. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately issue a citation based solely on the initial observation, without allowing the company an opportunity to provide further information or context through the proper administrative channels. This is professionally unacceptable, as it fails to afford the company due process and may not reflect a complete understanding of the situation, potentially leading to an erroneous or overly punitive enforcement action. Alabama administrative law emphasizes procedural fairness, which includes providing regulated parties with opportunities to be heard and to present evidence. A final incorrect approach would be to dismiss the potential violation outright based on the company's assurances without independent verification or proper documentation. This is professionally unacceptable because it abdicates the officer's responsibility to enforce environmental regulations and could be seen as succumbing to pressure or influence, undermining public trust and the effectiveness of ADEM oversight. It also fails to establish a clear record of the inspection and the basis for any decision, leaving ADEM vulnerable to criticism and legal challenge. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to established procedures, meticulous documentation, impartiality, and transparency. This involves understanding the relevant administrative laws and regulations of Alabama, consulting with supervisors when faced with ambiguous situations, and always acting in a manner that upholds the public trust and the integrity of the regulatory process. Question 2. The review process indicates that a legal scholar in Alabama is preparing a comparative law analysis of contract formation statutes in Alabama and Mississippi. The scholar aims to identify commonalities and divergences in how offer and acceptance are treated under each state's laws. Which of the following approaches best fulfills the requirements of a rigorous comparative law analysis within the specified jurisdictions? Option A. Assume that due to their proximity and shared common law heritage, the contract formation laws of Alabama and Mississippi are largely similar and can be analyzed as a unified body of law. Option B. Focus the analysis on the historical development of contract law in the United States, using this broad historical context to explain any similarities or differences observed between Alabama and Mississippi. Option C. Primarily consult general principles of contract law from a widely recognized treatise or a third jurisdiction's legal framework to infer how Alabama and Mississippi likely treat offer and acceptance. Option D. Independently analyze the specific statutory language and relevant case law for offer and acceptance in Alabama, and then independently analyze the specific statutory language and relevant case law for offer and acceptance in Mississippi before comparing the findings. The correct answer is D. Independently analyze the specific statutory language and relevant case law for offer and acceptance in Alabama, and then independently analyze the specific statutory language and relevant case law for offer and acceptance in Mississippi before comparing the findings. Explanation. The review process indicates that a legal scholar in Alabama is preparing a comparative law analysis of contract formation statutes in Alabama and Mississippi. The scholar is tasked with identifying commonalities and divergences in how offer and acceptance are treated under each state's laws. This scenario is professionally challenging because comparative law requires meticulous attention to the specific legal frameworks of each jurisdiction, avoiding overgeneralization or the imposition of one legal system's assumptions onto another. Careful judgment is required to ensure the analysis is accurate, objective, and legally sound, respecting the distinct legislative intent and judicial interpretation within each state. The best approach involves a rigorous, jurisdiction-specific examination of each state's statutory language and relevant case law concerning offer and acceptance. This entails isolating the precise definitions and requirements for a valid offer and acceptance as articulated by Alabama statutes and Mississippi statutes independently. Subsequently, the scholar would compare these distinct legal constructs to identify areas of convergence and divergence. This method is correct because it adheres to the fundamental principles of comparative law, which demand a deep understanding of each legal system on its own terms before drawing comparisons. It respects the sovereignty of each state's legislative and judicial branches and ensures the analysis is grounded in the actual law of Alabama and Mississippi, not in abstract legal theories or the laws of other jurisdictions. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide accurate and well-supported legal analysis. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because Alabama and Mississippi are neighboring states with similar common law traditions, their contract formation laws are likely identical or can be treated as a single unit for comparative purposes. This assumption risks overlooking subtle but significant differences in statutory wording or judicial interpretation that could lead to erroneous conclusions about the scope of comparative law in this context. It fails to engage in the detailed, state-by-state analysis required for accurate comparative law. Another incorrect approach would be to rely heavily on general principles of contract law derived from a textbook or a third jurisdiction, applying them broadly to both Alabama and Mississippi, without first verifying their specific applicability and interpretation within each state's statutory framework. This approach risks misrepresenting the law of Alabama and Mississippi by imposing external legal norms, thereby failing to accurately capture the unique legal landscape of each state and undermining the core purpose of comparative law, which is to understand and contrast distinct legal systems. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the historical evolution of contract law in the United States generally, without prioritizing the current statutory provisions and judicial precedents in Alabama and Mississippi. While historical context can be valuable, the primary goal of comparative law in this instance is to analyze the present-day legal rules and their practical application within the specified jurisdictions. Neglecting the current statutory framework in favor of historical trends would result in an analysis that is not grounded in the operative law of Alabama and Mississippi. The professional reasoning process for professionals in similar situations should involve a commitment to jurisdictional specificity. This means always starting with the primary sources of law for each jurisdiction under examination statutes, regulations, and controlling case law. Professionals should then engage in a systematic process of identifying, defining, and comparing the legal concepts in question within each jurisdiction before attempting to synthesize or contrast them. A critical self-assessment of potential biases or assumptions about legal similarity between jurisdictions is also crucial. The goal is always to achieve an objective and accurate understanding of each legal system before drawing comparative conclusions. Question 3. Examination of the data shows that an Alabama resident, MS, Alina Vance, is seeking investment advice regarding a new opportunity in a rapidly developing market in a European country. The investment is presented as highly lucrative, but is regulated under that European country's specific financial oversight body, which has approved the product. MS. Vance is primarily concerned with capital preservation, but is also interested in growth. The financial advisor is based in Alabama and licensed to practice in Alabama. What is the most prudent course of action for the Alabama-based financial advisor? Option A. Advise MS. Vance that while the investment is approved in its home country, the advisor must conduct an independent assessment to ensure it complies with Alabama's specific securities regulations, is suitable for her stated objectives of capital preservation and growth, and that all associated risks are fully disclosed according to Alabama law. Option B. Recommend the investment to MS. Vance, citing its approval by the European country's financial oversight body as sufficient validation for an Alabama resident. Option C. Advise MS. Vance to seek legal counsel in the European country to understand the investment's regulatory framework before proceeding, without independently verifying its compliance with Alabama law. Option D. Proceed with recommending the investment, focusing solely on the potential for high growth, and inform MS. Vance that capital preservation is a secondary concern given the opportunity. The correct answer is A. Advise MS. Vance that while the investment is approved in its home country, the advisor must conduct an independent assessment to ensure it complies with Alabama's specific securities regulations, is suitable for her stated objectives of capital preservation and growth, and that all associated risks are fully disclosed according to Alabama law. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a financial advisor to navigate the complexities of cross-border legal frameworks and client expectations, particularly when dealing with investments that may be subject to different regulatory regimes. The advisor must prioritize adherence to the laws of the jurisdiction where the client is domiciled and where the advice is being provided, while also being aware of potential implications in other jurisdictions. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of Alabama's specific regulations governing financial advice and investment products, coupled with a commitment to transparency and client best interests. This means ensuring that any recommendation is compliant with Alabama law, suitable for the client's risk profile and financial goals, and that all relevant disclosures are made in accordance with Alabama's consumer protection and securities laws. The advisor must act with due diligence, verifying the legitimacy and regulatory standing of any foreign investment opportunities within the context of Alabama's legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a foreign jurisdiction's regulatory approval automatically validates an investment for an Alabama resident. This fails to recognize that Alabama law dictates the standards for financial advice and product suitability offered to its residents. Promoting an investment solely based on its compliance in another country, without assessing its alignment with Alabama's regulatory requirements and the client's specific circumstances under Alabama law, constitutes a significant regulatory failure. It could lead to violations of Alabama's securities laws, fiduciary duties, and consumer protection statutes, potentially exposing both the advisor and the client to financial and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the potential for higher returns in a foreign market without adequately disclosing the increased risks and regulatory uncertainties associated with such investments to an Alabama client. This demonstrates a lack of diligence in understanding the full scope of risks and a failure to meet the ethical obligation of informed consent under Alabama law. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic evaluation of the client's needs and objectives, followed by a rigorous assessment of any proposed investment against the backdrop of Alabama's regulatory landscape. This includes understanding the specific licensing requirements, disclosure obligations, and suitability standards mandated by Alabama law. If an investment involves foreign jurisdictions, the advisor must conduct independent due diligence to ensure it can be legally and ethically offered to an Alabama resident, and that all associated risks are clearly communicated. Question 4. Upon reviewing the regulatory landscape for financial advisory services in Alabama, a financial advisor must determine the most appropriate compliance strategy. Considering Alabama's position within the federal system, which of the following approaches best ensures adherence to all applicable legal and ethical standards? Option A. Adhering exclusively to the regulatory framework established by the state of Alabama, assuming these laws provide comprehensive coverage for all financial advisory activities. Option B. Relying solely on compliance with federal securities laws and regulations, as these are generally considered the primary framework for financial services nationwide. Option C. Complying with all federal securities laws and regulations, and additionally ensuring full adherence to all specific registration, disclosure, and conduct requirements mandated by the state of Alabama. Option D. Applying federal and Alabama regulations only where there appears to be direct overlap, and otherwise proceeding based on industry best practices. The correct answer is C. Complying with all federal securities laws and regulations, and additionally ensuring full adherence to all specific registration, disclosure, and conduct requirements mandated by the state of Alabama. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor to navigate the complexities of Alabama's legal framework, specifically concerning the division of powers between the federal government and the state government. Misunderstanding or misapplying these jurisdictional principles can lead to significant legal and ethical breaches. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. The correct approach involves recognizing that while federal securities laws provide a baseline for regulation, Alabama has its own specific statutes and regulatory bodies that govern financial advisory activities within the state. Therefore, an advisor must ensure compliance with both federal requirements and any additional or more stringent regulations imposed by Alabama. This dual compliance is essential because Alabama's unitary system allows the state to enact laws that supplement or, in some cases, provide greater protection than federal law, as long as they do not directly conflict with federal supremacy. Adhering to Alabama's specific registration requirements, disclosure mandates, and suitability standards, in addition to federal ones, is the most professionally sound and legally defensible course of action. An incorrect approach would be to assume that federal regulations alone are sufficient for operating in Alabama. This overlooks Alabama's sovereign power to regulate activities within its borders. Such an approach would fail to comply with Alabama-specific statutes, potentially leading to unregistered practice, violations of state consumer protection laws, and penalties from the Alabama Securities Commission. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively follow Alabama's regulations without considering federal oversight. Alabama has its own framework. Federal securities laws, such as the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, establish overarching principles and registration requirements that cannot be ignored. Failing to comply with federal mandates would expose the advisor to actions by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and potential federal prosecution. A final incorrect approach would be to selectively apply regulations based on convenience or perceived overlap. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a misunderstanding of the layered regulatory system. Professionals have an ethical and legal duty to understand and comply with all applicable laws, both federal and state, to protect their clients and maintain their professional standing. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying all relevant jurisdictions, federal, and state. They must then research and understand the specific laws, regulations, and administrative rules of each jurisdiction that apply to their practice. A proactive approach to compliance, seeking clarification from regulatory bodies or legal counsel when in doubt, is crucial for ethical and effective practice. Question 5. When evaluating the legal landscape for a client whose business operations are expanding into a jurisdiction that primarily follows a civil law tradition, and you are a legal practitioner licensed in Alabama, what is the most prudent and legally sound approach to ensure competent representation? Option A. Focus solely on the statutory text of the civil law jurisdiction, disregarding any judicial decisions as non-binding. Option B. Assume the civil law jurisdiction's legal system operates identically to Alabama's common law system and rely on familiar legal reasoning. Option C. Conduct thorough research into the codified statutes of the civil law jurisdiction and consult with local counsel to understand judicial interpretations of those statutes. Option D. Apply Alabama's common law principles of stare decisis and precedent to predict how similar legal issues would be resolved in the new jurisdiction. The correct answer is C. Conduct thorough research into the codified statutes of the civil law jurisdiction and consult with local counsel to understand judicial interpretations of those statutes. Explanation. When evaluating the foundational principles of legal systems in Alabama, understanding the distinctions between common law and civil law traditions is crucial for legal professionals. This scenario presents a challenge because a lawyer, accustomed to the precedent-driven nature of Alabama's common law system, is tasked with advising a client on a matter involving a jurisdiction that primarily operates under a civil law framework. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying the governing legal principles, understanding how judicial decisions are treated, and applying the correct interpretive methods to achieve a favorable outcome for the client, all while adhering to Alabama's ethical obligations regarding competence and diligence. The best approach involves recognizing the fundamental differences in how legal rules are created and applied. In a common law system like Alabama, judicial precedent, stare decisis, plays a significant role in shaping the law. Legal reasoning often involves analogizing from past cases. In contrast, a civil law system emphasizes codified statutes as the primary source of law, with judicial decisions serving more as interpretations of those codes rather than binding precedents in the common law sense. Therefore, the most effective strategy is to thoroughly research and understand the specific codified laws of the civil law jurisdiction, paying close attention to how those statutes are interpreted by the courts in that jurisdiction, and to consult with local counsel, if necessary, to ensure accurate application of the law. This respects the distinct nature of the civil law system and ensures the client receives advice grounded in the correct legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to assume that Alabama's common law principles of precedent and judicial interpretation are directly transferable to the civil law jurisdiction. Relying heavily on Alabama case law to predict outcomes in a civil law system would be a significant error, as judicial decisions in civil law countries are generally not binding on future courts in the same way they are in common law systems. This failure to appreciate the distinct legal tradition would lead to flawed legal analysis and potentially detrimental advice for the client. Another unacceptable approach would be to solely focus on the statutory text of the civil law jurisdiction without considering the established judicial interpretations of those statutes. While statutes are paramount in civil law, their application and meaning are often clarified and refined through case law. Ignoring these judicial interpretations would lead to an incomplete understanding of the law and could result in misapplication. Finally, a flawed strategy would be to dismiss the civil law jurisdiction's legal system as inherently less sophisticated or reliable than Alabama's common law system. Such an ethnocentric view would prevent a proper and objective analysis of the applicable law and would fail to serve the client's best interests. Professionals should approach such cross-jurisdictional legal issues by first identifying the governing legal system, then conducting in-depth research into the specific sources of law, statutes, codes, relevant judicial interpretations within that system, and critically evaluating how those sources interact. When unfamiliar with a particular legal tradition, seeking specialized knowledge through continuing legal education, consulting with experts, or engaging local counsel is a prudent and ethical step. Question 6. The analysis reveals a potential conflict between proposed state legislation in Alabama aimed at regulating public demonstrations, and the protections afforded by the Alabama Bill of Rights concerning freedom of speech and assembly. Considering the unique legal interpretations within Alabama, what is the most prudent approach for legal counsel advising the state legislature on the constitutionality of this proposed legislation? Option A. Rely solely on the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, assuming that Alabama's protections are identical and do not offer any additional safeguards. Option B. Focus exclusively on the text of the Alabama Bill of Rights without considering any federal constitutional precedent or the practical implications of enforcement. Option C. Conduct a detailed comparative analysis of how the Alabama Bill of Rights provisions on speech and assembly have been interpreted by Alabama courts, juxtaposing these with relevant U.S. Supreme Court decisions on similar federal rights to determine the scope of permissible state regulation. Option D. Advise the legislature that public order concerns inherently justify any reasonable restrictions on speech and assembly, as long as the legislation is enacted through the proper legislative process. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed comparative analysis of how the Alabama Bill of Rights provisions on speech and assembly have been interpreted by Alabama courts, juxtaposing these with relevant U.S. Supreme Court decisions on similar federal rights to determine the scope of permissible state regulation. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between upholding fundamental rights guaranteed by the Alabama Bill of Rights and the practical necessities of law enforcement in a rapidly evolving society. The core challenge lies in balancing the protection of individual liberties, such as freedom of speech and assembly, with the state's legitimate interest in maintaining public order and safety. This requires careful judgment to ensure that any restrictions on these rights are narrowly tailored, serve a compelling government interest, and do not unduly infringe upon constitutional protections. The best professional approach involves a thorough comparative analysis of how the Alabama Bill of Rights, particularly its provisions on freedom of speech and assembly, has been interpreted and applied in relation to similar rights under the U.S. Constitution. This approach is correct because it grounds the analysis in established legal precedent and constitutional principles. By examining how Alabama courts have balanced these rights against state interests, and by considering how federal jurisprudence has addressed analogous situations, a legal professional can identify the contours of permissible state action. This comparative method allows for nuanced understanding of the specific protections afforded by Alabama law, ensuring that any proposed legislation or policy is consistent with both state and federal constitutional standards, thereby minimizing the risk of legal challenge and upholding individual liberties. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the text of the U.S. Bill of Rights without considering the specific interpretations and applications by Alabama state courts. This failure is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the distinct legal landscape of Alabama, where state constitutional provisions may offer broader or different protections than their federal counterparts. Alabama's Bill of Rights is not merely a mirror of the U.S. Bill of Rights. It is an independent source of rights that can be interpreted more expansively by state courts. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the perceived needs of public order or law enforcement efficiency over the explicit protections guaranteed by the Alabama Bill of Rights, without a rigorous legal justification. This approach is ethically and legally flawed, as it suggests a willingness to compromise fundamental rights based on expediency rather than constitutional mandate. The Alabama Constitution, like the U.S. Constitution, establishes a framework where individual liberties are paramount and can only be infringed upon under strict legal scrutiny, requiring a compelling state interest and narrowly tailored means. A further incorrect approach would be to assume that any restriction on speech or assembly is permissible as long as it is enacted by the state legislature. This overlooks the fundamental principle of judicial review, where legislative actions are subject to constitutional scrutiny. The Alabama Supreme Court, for instance, has the authority to strike down laws that violate the Alabama Bill of Rights. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the specific rights implicated under the Alabama Bill of Rights. Second, research relevant Alabama case law interpreting these rights, paying close attention to how Alabama courts have balanced these rights against state interests. Third, Conduct a comparative analysis with U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence on similar federal rights, recognizing that federal law sets a minimum standard, but Alabama law may provide greater protection. Fourth, assess the proposed action or policy against these established legal standards, ensuring it is narrowly tailored, serves a compelling state interest, and is the least restrictive means of achieving that interest. Finally, consult with experienced legal counsel specializing in constitutional law in Alabama to ensure full compliance. Question 7. Comparative studies suggest that when advising a client whose business operations in Alabama are impacted by international trade agreements, a legal professional should prioritize understanding the nuances of foreign legal systems. Considering the specific regulatory framework of Alabama, which of the following approaches best balances the client's interests with the governing legal jurisdiction? Option A. Present foreign legal principles to Alabama courts as if they were binding precedent, without clearly articulating their origin and persuasive, rather than mandatory, authority. Option B. Focus primarily on adopting legal principles from foreign jurisdictions that appear more advantageous to the client's situation, assuming these principles can be directly applied to resolve disputes or establish rights within Alabama. Option C. Thoroughly research and understand Alabama statutes and case law relevant to the client's business, and then selectively analyze foreign legal systems to identify principles that can be strategically integrated to support arguments or inform negotiations within the existing Alabama legal framework, ensuring all actions comply with Alabama procedural and substantive law. Option D. Disregard any foreign legal systems, even if they have direct relevance to the client's international dealings, as Alabama law is the sole governing authority and comparative analysis is unnecessary. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research and understand Alabama statutes and case law relevant to the client's business, and then selectively analyze foreign legal systems to identify principles that can be strategically integrated to support arguments or inform negotiations within the existing Alabama legal framework, ensuring all actions comply with Alabama procedural and substantive law. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional in Alabama to navigate the complexities of differing legal traditions and their practical implications for a client's case. The core difficulty lies in identifying and applying relevant foreign legal principles without compromising the integrity of Alabama's own legal framework or misrepresenting the client's position. Careful judgment is required to ensure that comparative legal analysis serves to inform, rather than dictate, the strategy within the Alabama legal context. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of Alabama law to establish the baseline legal rights and obligations. Subsequently, relevant foreign legal systems are analyzed to identify potential points of convergence or divergence that could offer strategic advantages or highlight risks. This comparative analysis is then used to inform the interpretation of Alabama statutes, the development of arguments within the existing Alabama legal framework, and the negotiation of potential settlements, always prioritizing adherence to Alabama's procedural and substantive rules. This approach is correct because it respects the primacy of Alabama law while leveraging comparative insights to enhance advocacy and client representation. It aligns with the ethical duty to provide competent representation within the governing jurisdiction. An incorrect approach would be to uncritically adopt principles from a foreign legal system simply because they appear more favorable, without a rigorous assessment of their applicability and compatibility with Alabama law. This risks misadvising the client, filing inappropriate legal actions, or presenting arguments that are procedurally unsound under Alabama rules, leading to potential sanctions or dismissal of the case. Another incorrect approach is to ignore foreign legal systems entirely, even when they are demonstrably relevant to the client's situation. This failure to explore all available avenues for client benefit, particularly in cases with international elements or where precedent from other common law jurisdictions might offer persuasive authority, falls short of the duty to provide comprehensive and competent legal counsel. A further incorrect approach involves misrepresenting the status or applicability of foreign law to the Alabama court. This could involve presenting foreign legal principles as binding precedent in Alabama or overstating their persuasive weight, which constitutes a breach of candor to the court and potentially unethical conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a deep understanding of the governing jurisdiction's laws. In this case, Alabama. This is followed by a targeted comparative analysis of foreign legal systems, only where there is a clear potential to benefit the client or inform the legal strategy within the Alabama context. The ultimate goal is to integrate these comparative insights judiciously to strengthen the client's position under Alabama law, rather than to supplant it. Question 8. The investigation demonstrates that when advising a client in Alabama on a complex contractual dispute with potential international implications, which approach to understanding the historical development of comparative law would best equip a legal professional to navigate the nuances of the case. Option A. Comprehensive study of the historical evolution of legal thought and institutions that have influenced both Alabama's common law tradition and the broader field of comparative legal studies. Option B. A singular focus on the most recent Alabama statutes and judicial decisions relevant to contract law, disregarding any historical context. Option C. A complete disregard for the principles of comparative law, asserting that only Alabama domestic law is relevant to the dispute. Option D. The direct application of contract principles from a single, prominent civil law jurisdiction without assessing their historical compatibility with Alabama law. Correct answer is A. A comprehensive study of the historical evolution of legal thought and institutions that have influenced both Alabama's common law tradition and the broader field of comparative legal studies. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates that understanding the historical development of comparative law is crucial for legal professionals in Alabama, particularly when dealing with cross-border disputes or advising clients with international interests. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not just knowledge of current Alabama law, but also an appreciation for how legal systems have evolved and influenced each other, which can inform interpretation and strategy. Careful judgment is required to select the most effective approach to legal research and analysis in such contexts. The best approach involves a nuanced examination of the historical trajectory of legal thought and institutions that have shaped both Alabama's common law heritage and the development of comparative legal studies. This includes tracing the influence of English common law, the reception of Roman law principles in certain areas, and the impact of Enlightenment philosophy on legal systems. Understanding these historical currents allows for a deeper comprehension of the underlying rationales for legal rules and the potential for convergence or divergence between legal systems. This is correct because it directly supports the analytical needs of comparative law, enabling a lawyer to identify common roots, understand differing policy choices, and predict potential areas of conflict or harmony between legal traditions. It aligns with the ethical duty to provide competent representation by equipping the legal professional with a robust analytical framework that transcends mere statutory or case law recitation. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the current statutory and case law of Alabama without considering the historical evolution of its legal principles or the broader context of comparative legal scholarship. This failure neglects the foundational influences that have shaped Alabama's legal landscape and limits the ability to understand the origins and rationale behind existing laws, hindering effective comparative analysis. Another incorrect approach would be to indiscriminately apply principles from a single foreign legal system to an Alabama legal question, assuming a direct equivalence without historical or doctrinal justification. This overlooks the unique development of Alabama law and the specific policy considerations that underpin its rules, leading to potentially erroneous conclusions and misinformed advice. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the study of comparative law as irrelevant to Alabama practice, focusing exclusively on domestic legal precedents. This is a significant professional failing, as it ignores the increasing globalization of commerce and legal interactions, which necessitates an understanding of other legal systems for comprehensive client service and effective advocacy. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the core legal issue. Then, they should consider whether the issue has any comparative dimensions. If so, they should research the historical development of the relevant legal concepts in Alabama and in other potentially relevant jurisdictions, drawing upon scholarly works on comparative law and legal history. This historical understanding should then inform the analysis of current laws and the formulation of legal arguments or advice, ensuring a well-reasoned and contextually appropriate approach. Question 9. Analysis of a contractual dispute arising from a commercial agreement between an Alabama-based company and a French corporation reveals that the contract contains no choice of law provision and no forum selection clause. The contract was negotiated and signed in Paris, France. The Alabama company now seeks to sue the French corporation in an Alabama state court. What is the most appropriate initial step for the Alabama court to take in determining which jurisdiction's substantive law should govern the dispute? Option A. Defer to the party's implied intent to apply French law due to the significant involvement of the French corporation. Option B. Immediately apply French substantive law, given that the contract was negotiated and signed in France. Option C. Conduct a conflict of laws analysis under Alabama's established legal principles to determine if French law should apply, and if so, require proof of French law. Option D. Apply Alabama substantive law by default, as the lawsuit is being filed in an Alabama court. The correct answer is C. Conduct a conflict of laws analysis under Alabama's established legal principles to determine if French law should apply, and if so, require proof of French law. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the complexities of international legal frameworks and understanding how Alabama courts would approach a dispute involving foreign law. The core difficulty lies in determining the appropriate method for applying or considering French civil law principles within an Alabama legal context, especially when the contract itself is silent on governing law and dispute resolution. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's procedural rules and substantive law regarding the recognition and application of foreign legal systems. The best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of Alabama's conflict of laws principles to ascertain whether French law should be applied. This would entail researching Alabama statutes and case law that address choice of law provisions in contracts, particularly where no explicit choice has been made by the parties. The Alabama Rules of Civil Procedure and relevant judicial precedents would guide the court in determining which jurisdiction's law has the most significant relationship to the transaction and the parties. If Alabama law mandates the application of French law under these circumstances, the next step would be to seek expert testimony or other admissible evidence to establish the content and meaning of the relevant French legal provisions. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to Alabama's established legal framework for resolving choice of law issues, and ensures that any foreign law applied is properly proven and understood within the context of an Alabama court proceeding. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally assume that French law governs simply because the contract was drafted in France or involves a French entity. Alabama courts do not automatically defer to foreign law based on the location of contract formation or the nationality of parties. This failure to engage with Alabama's conflict of laws analysis would lead to an improper application of law. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard French law entirely and apply Alabama law without a proper conflict of laws determination. While Alabama law might ultimately apply, this decision must be reached through the established legal process, not by default. Ignoring the potential relevance of French law without due consideration of Alabama's conflict of laws rules is procedurally unsound. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely on general principles of international comity without first establishing the legal basis under Alabama law for applying or considering foreign law. While comity can play a role, it is typically applied within the framework of existing state law and procedural rules. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive understanding of the governing jurisdiction's conflict of laws rules. This involves identifying the relevant statutes and case law that dictate how to resolve disputes involving potentially applicable foreign laws. Once the governing jurisdiction's rules are understood, the next step is to analyze the specific facts of the case to determine which jurisdiction has the most significant relationship to the dispute. If foreign law is deemed potentially applicable, professionals must then determine the proper method for proving that foreign law within the forum court, often through expert testimony or other recognized evidentiary means. Question 10. Consider a scenario where a plaintiff has suffered economic damages due to a tortious act. If the applicable laws for calculating these damages are those of Alabama and Mississippi, and the plaintiff's total documented lost wages and medical expenses amount to $500,000, with an additional projected future earning capacity loss of $200,000, Under Alabama law, future earning capacity loss is discounted at an annual rate of 5% for a period of 10 years. Under Mississippi law, future earning capacity loss is discounted at an annual rate of 4% for a period of 12 years. Assuming a simple interest calculation for lost wages and medical expenses in both states, what would be the total economic damages calculated separately under each state's methodology? Option A, Alabama, $700,000 plus $200,000 $10.05 equals $630,000. Mississippi, $700,000 plus $200,000 $10.04 equals $592,000. Option B, Alabama, $700,000 plus $200,000 $0.05 equals $900,000. Mississippi, $700,000 plus $200,000 $0.04 equals $940,000. Option C, Alabama, $700,000 plus $200,000 equals $900,000. Mississippi, $700,000 plus $200,000 equals $900,000. Option D, Alabama, $700,000 plus $200,000 1 plus 0, 0510 equals $700,000 plus $122,782. 65 equals $822,782. 65. Mississippi, $700,000 plus $200,000 1 plus 0, 0412 equals $700,000 plus $124, 875. 69 equals $824, 875, 69. The correct answer is D, Alabama, $700,000 plus $200,000 1 plus 0, 0510 equals $700,000 plus $122,782. 65 equals $822,782. 65. Mississippi, $700,000 plus $200,000 1 plus 0, 0412 equals $700,000 plus $124, 875. 69 equals $824, 875. 69. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a comparative legal analysis of two distinct legal systems, Alabama and Mississippi, concerning the calculation of damages in a tort case. The core difficulty lies in accurately applying the methodologies of each jurisdiction to determine the appropriate compensation, ensuring fairness to the plaintiff while adhering to the specific legal frameworks of each state. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting or misapplying the relevant statutory and case law. The correct approach involves meticulously calculating the economic damages under Alabama law, and then separately calculating the economic damages under Mississippi law, and finally, presenting both figures clearly. This method is correct because it directly addresses the comparative aspect of the question by isolating and applying each jurisdiction's specific rules for economic damage calculation. Alabama's approach to economic damages, as outlined in its statutes and case law, will dictate the types of losses recoverable and the methods for quantifying them, e.g., lost wages, medical expenses, future earning capacity. Similarly, Mississippi's legal framework will have its own specific rules. By calculating each independently, the analysis remains true to the comparative methodology, allowing for a direct comparison of outcomes under each legal system. This adheres to the principle of respecting the distinct legal traditions and legislative intent of each state. An incorrect approach would be to average the potential damage awards from both states without a clear legal basis for doing so. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the rigorous application of each jurisdiction's specific damage calculation methodologies. There is no legal precedent or statutory authority in either Alabama or Mississippi that sanctions averaging damage calculations from different states as a legitimate method for determining compensation. This approach fails to respect the distinct legal frameworks and could lead to an award that is neither compliant with Alabama law nor Mississippi law, potentially resulting in an unjust outcome for the plaintiff or an overaward. Another incorrect approach would be to apply only Alabama's damage calculation methodology to the entire scenario, regardless of where the harm occurred or where the defendant resides. This is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the comparative nature of the question and the potential applicability of Mississippi law. If the tort occurred in Mississippi, or if the defendant has significant ties to Mississippi, then Mississippi's laws regarding damages would likely be relevant and must be considered. Failing to do so would be a violation of the principles of comparative law and could lead to a legally flawed analysis. A third incorrect approach would be to use a generalized formula for calculating damages that is not derived from either Alabama or Mississippi law. This is professionally unacceptable because comparative law demands adherence to the specific legal rules and precedents of the jurisdictions being compared. Generic formulas, even if mathematically sound, lack the legal grounding necessary to be applied in a comparative legal analysis within a specific state context like Alabama or Mississippi. Such an approach would be speculative and not based on established legal principles, rendering the comparison invalid. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly identifying the jurisdictions involved and the specific legal issue to be compared, in this case, economic damage calculation in tort. 2. Thoroughly researching the statutory and case law of each jurisdiction pertaining to the issue. 3. Applying the legal rules of each jurisdiction independently to the facts of the scenario. 4. Quantifying the results of each application using appropriate mathematical or financial methods as dictated by the respective laws. 5. Presenting the distinct outcomes clearly, highlighting the differences and the legal reasoning behind them. Question 11. During the evaluation of a product liability claim where an Alabama resident was allegedly injured by a product manufactured in Georgia, what is the most prudent legal strategy to pursue within the Alabama court system, considering potential conflicts of law? Option A. Immediately file the lawsuit in Alabama, asserting claims solely based on Georgia's product liability statutes, assuming the place of manufacture dictates the governing law. Option B. Advise the client to refile the claim in Georgia, as the product was manufactured there, to avoid potential complexities of interstate legal application in Alabama. Option C. Conduct a thorough analysis of Alabama's conflict of laws rules to determine the governing substantive law for the product liability claim, and then proceed with litigation based on the determined applicable law, focusing on Alabama's standards for negligence or strict liability and damages. Option D. Prioritize the recovery of damages by focusing on the most favorable damage calculation methods, regardless of the specific liability standards of either Alabama or Georgia. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough analysis of Alabama's conflict of laws rules to determine the governing substantive law for the product liability claim, and then proceed with litigation based on the determined applicable law, focusing on Alabama's standards for negligence or strict liability and damages. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of applying Alabama's comparative negligence principles to a cross-jurisdictional dispute involving a product manufactured in Georgia and allegedly causing harm in Alabama. The core difficulty lies in reconciling potentially different legal standards for product liability and damages, and determining which state's laws should govern the case, especially when the plaintiff is an Alabama resident. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen legal strategy aligns with Alabama's procedural rules and substantive law, while also respecting the principles of comity and interstate legal cooperation. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of Alabama's conflict of laws rules to determine the governing substantive law for the product liability claim. This would entail examining Alabama's approach to choice of law, particularly in tort cases, and considering factors such as the place of injury, the domicile of the plaintiff, and the place of manufacture. If Alabama law is determined to apply, the The subsequent legal strategy should focus on demonstrating negligence or strict liability under Alabama Code provisions, and presenting evidence that aligns with Alabama's evidentiary standards for proving causation and damages. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to Alabama's legal framework, ensuring that the case is litigated according to the procedural and substantive laws of the forum state where the plaintiff resides and seeks redress. This respects the jurisdiction of the Alabama courts and aims to provide the plaintiff with the protections afforded by Alabama law. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Georgia's product liability laws, without a proper conflict of laws analysis under Alabama rules. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama courts will apply their own choice of law rules to determine which state's substantive law governs. Proceeding under Georgia law without this preliminary step risks the case being dismissed or significantly hampered if Alabama law dictates a different outcome or standard. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that the location of manufacture, Georgia, automatically dictates the governing law, irrespective of the place of injury and the plaintiff's residence in Alabama. While the place of manufacture is a factor in some choice of law analyses, Alabama courts prioritize the place of injury and the domicile of the injured party in tort cases, especially when seeking to protect its residents. A further incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on the damages aspect without first establishing liability under the appropriate legal framework. While maximizing damages is a goal, it is secondary to proving that a legal wrong occurred under the governing law. Without a solid foundation of liability, any attempt to recover damages will be unsuccessful. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the forum states, Alabama's, procedural rules and conflict of laws principles. This should be followed by an assessment of the substantive laws of all potentially relevant jurisdictions. The strategy should then be formulated to align with the governing law as determined by the forum state's choice of law rules, ensuring that all claims and evidence meet the required standards for that jurisdiction. Question 12. Research into the application of Jewish law halakha by a client in Alabama raises a question for their legal counsel regarding how to best advise them on a property dispute. The client, a devout adherent of Orthodox Judaism, believes that certain aspects of the proposed settlement agreement, particularly concerning the division of inherited property, may conflict with their understanding of halakha regarding family obligations and the sanctity of inherited assets. The legal counsel must determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure competent and ethical representation within the Alabama legal system. Option A. Recommend that the client seek separate legal counsel specializing in religious law, effectively disengaging from the aspect of the dispute that involves halakha, and only handle the purely secular legal elements. Option B. Advise the client that Jewish law is not a factor in Alabama property disputes, and proceed solely based on secular legal principles and the perceived best outcome under Alabama law. Option C. Interpret the client's statements about Jewish law based on general knowledge and proceed with a settlement strategy that prioritizes expediency and a quick resolution, assuming the client will adapt to the legal outcome. Option D. Research the specific halakhic principles cited by the client. Consult with a qualified rabbinic authority or expert in Jewish law if necessary, and then integrate this understanding into the legal strategy, ensuring compliance with Alabama property law and ethical obligations. The correct answer is D. Research the specific halakhic principles cited by the client. Consult with a qualified rabbinic authority or expert in Jewish law if necessary, and then integrate this understanding into the legal strategy, ensuring compliance with Alabama property law and ethical obligations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating a complex ethical and legal landscape where religious law intersects with secular legal principles. A legal professional in Alabama must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance with both state law and the ethical considerations arising from a client's deeply held religious beliefs, particularly when those beliefs might influence their legal rights or obligations. The challenge lies in providing competent representation without imposing personal beliefs or misinterpreting the application of Jewish law within the Alabama legal framework. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of the client's specific situation within the context of Jewish law halakha, and then determining how those principles interact with applicable Alabama statutes and case law. This approach requires the legal professional to research and consult with experts if necessary to accurately interpret the relevant halakhic principles and their potential legal implications in Alabama. The justification for this approach is rooted in the ethical duty of competence, which mandates that a lawyer must possess the legal knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation reasonably necessary for the representation of a client. Furthermore, it aligns with the principle of client autonomy, ensuring that the client's religious beliefs are respected and integrated into the legal strategy in a manner that is both legally sound and ethically permissible under Alabama law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns about Jewish law as irrelevant to the Alabama legal proceedings. This fails to acknowledge the potential impact of religious principles on a client's decision-making and their understanding of legal obligations, thereby violating the duty of competence and potentially leading to inadequate representation. It also demonstrates a lack of cultural sensitivity and respect for the client's deeply held beliefs. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally interpret and apply Jewish law based on the legal professional's own limited understanding or assumptions, without proper research or consultation. This is professionally unacceptable, as it risks misrepresenting the client's religious obligations and potentially advising them in a manner that is not in their best interest according to their own faith, thereby breaching the duty of competence and potentially engaging in the unauthorized practice of religious interpretation. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the client to disregard their religious obligations in favor of a purely secular legal strategy, without fully exploring how to reconcile both. This approach fails to uphold the client's right to practice their religion freely, as protected by constitutional principles, and may lead to undue stress and conflict for the client, undermining the trust essential to the attorney-client relationship. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a framework that prioritizes client-centered representation, ethical compliance, and thorough legal research. This involves actively listening to the client's concerns, identifying potential conflicts or intersections between religious and secular law, conducting diligent research into both areas, and seeking expert advice when necessary. The ultimate goal is to provide competent legal counsel that respects the client's values and operates within the bounds of Alabama law and professional ethics. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a potential for procedural missteps in a complex criminal case in Alabama involving multiple defendants and overlapping evidence. Considering Alabama's rules of criminal procedure and constitutional due process requirements, which of the following strategies best optimizes the process while safeguarding the rights of all parties? Option A. Proceed with a consolidated trial, assuming that the jury can adequately distinguish evidence pertaining to each defendant and address any discovery disputes as they arise during the proceedings. Option B. Conduct comprehensive pretrial conferences with all defense counsel to establish discovery timelines, agree on evidence presentation, and proactively address potential conflicts, including considering motions for severance if defendants' interests are antagonistic. Option C. Assume that all defendants' legal interests are aligned and proceed with a unified defense strategy, focusing solely on presenting the prosecution's case without extensive pretrial consultation with defense counsel. Option D. Prioritize the prosecution's efficiency by consolidating all defendants for trial and delaying the disclosure of any evidence that might be interpreted as exculpatory or impeaching until absolutely mandated by the court. The correct answer is B. Conduct comprehensive pretrial conferences with all defense counsel to establish discovery timelines, agree on evidence presentation, and proactively address potential conflicts, including considering motions for severance if defendants' interests are antagonistic. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential for procedural missteps in a complex criminal case involving multiple defendants and overlapping evidence. This scenario is professionally challenging because the prosecution must meticulously manage discovery and ensure each defendant's due process rights are upheld, while simultaneously seeking to streamline the trial process. The sheer volume of evidence and the distinct legal interests of each defendant create a high probability of error if not handled with extreme care and adherence to Alabama's rules of criminal procedure. The best approach involves a proactive and systematic strategy for managing discovery and trial proceedings. This includes conducting thorough pretrial conferences with all defense counsel to establish clear timelines for discovery exchange, agree on the scope of evidence to be presented, and identify potential areas of contention. Furthermore, the prosecution should consider filing motions for severance if the defendant's interests are genuinely antagonistic, thereby preventing prejudice and ensuring each defendant receives a fair trial. This approach aligns with Alabama Rule of Criminal Procedure 14, which allows for severance of defendants if it appears that justice so requires, and Rule 16, which governs discovery and mandates that the prosecution disclose relevant information to the defense. This methodical process optimizes efficiency by anticipating issues and addressing them before they derail the proceedings, thereby respecting the court's time and the defendant's rights. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with a consolidated trial without adequately addressing the potential for prejudice arising from the joint presentation of evidence. This could lead to a violation of a defendant's due process rights under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, as incorporated to the states, and potentially Alabama's constitutional guarantees of due process. Specifically, if the jury is unable to compartmentalize the evidence against each defendant, or if one defendant's defense strategy implicates another in a way that is unfairly prejudicial, a conviction could be overturned on appeal. Another unacceptable approach is to delay the disclosure of exculpatory evidence or evidence that could impeach prosecution witnesses. This directly contravenes the principles established in Brady v. Maryland and its progeny, which require the prosecution to disclose material exculpatory evidence to the defense. Failure to do so not only violates constitutional due process, but also undermines the integrity of the judicial process and can lead to wrongful convictions. Finally, a flawed strategy would be to assume that all defendants will cooperate or that their legal interests are aligned. This oversight can result in missed opportunities to address specific defense claims or objections early on, leading to protracted pretrial motions and potential delays during trial. It fails to acknowledge the adversarial nature of the criminal justice system and the distinct responsibilities the prosecution has to ensure a fair process for each individual. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes thorough case analysis, proactive communication with all parties, and a deep understanding of the applicable rules of procedure and constitutional law. This involves anticipating potential conflicts and procedural hurdles, seeking judicial guidance when necessary, and always acting with the utmost diligence to ensure a fair and efficient administration of justice. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that adapting legal advice to a client's prior familiarity with different legal systems is crucial for effective representation. If a client from a civil law jurisdiction, accustomed to an inquisitorial system, is now involved in legal proceedings in Alabama, what is the most ethically sound and procedurally compliant approach for their Alabama licensed attorney? Option A. Focus solely on the substantive legal issues of the case without dedicating time to explain the procedural differences between the inquisitorial and adversarial systems, believing that procedural nuances are secondary to the core legal dispute. Option B. Attempt to integrate elements of the inquisitorial system into the Alabama proceedings, such as the lawyer taking on a more investigative role that mirrors a judge's function in gathering evidence. Option C. Thoroughly explain the fundamental principles of Alabama's adversarial legal system, including the roles of the judge, opposing counsel, and the client, and how evidence is presented and contested, emphasizing the lawyer's duty of zealous advocacy within these parameters. Option D. Proceed with legal strategy as if the client fully understands the adversarial process, assuming their prior experience in an inquisitorial system has provided sufficient transferable knowledge for Alabama proceedings. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly explain the fundamental principles of Alabama's adversarial legal system, including the roles of the judge, opposing counsel, and the client, and how evidence is presented and contested, emphasizing the lawyer's duty of zealous advocacy within these parameters. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a lawyer to navigate the fundamental differences between Alabama's adversarial legal system and the inquisitorial system, particularly when advising a client who may be more familiar with the latter. The lawyer must ensure the client understands the implications of Alabama's procedural rules and ethical obligations, which are rooted in an adversarial framework, to avoid misunderstandings and potential prejudice to the client's case. Careful judgment is required to tailor advice to the client's background while strictly adhering to Alabama law. The best professional practice involves clearly explaining the core tenets of Alabama's adversarial system to the client. This includes emphasizing the roles of opposing counsel, the judge as a neutral arbiter, and the client's active participation in presenting evidence and arguments. The lawyer must highlight that in an adversarial system, the burden of proof rests on the parties, and the lawyer's primary duty is to zealously advocate for their client within the bounds of the law, which may differ significantly from the judge-led investigation characteristic of an inquisitorial system. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the client's potential confusion by grounding the advice in the specific legal framework of Alabama, ensuring informed consent and proper representation as mandated by the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct, which prioritize client understanding, and the lawyer's duty of zealous advocacy within the established adversarial process. An incorrect approach would be to assume the client's understanding of legal processes is universal and proceed with advice, without explicitly detailing the adversarial nature of Alabama proceedings. This failure to educate the client about the procedural differences could lead to the client having unrealistic expectations about the lawyer's role or the court's involvement, potentially jeopardizing the client's ability to effectively participate in their defense or prosecution. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to replicate aspects of an inquisitorial system within the Alabama adversarial framework, such as the lawyer acting as an investigator in a manner that usurps the judge's or opposing counsel's roles. This would violate the adversarial principles and could lead to ethical breaches, such as overstepping professional boundaries or failing to adequately represent the client's interests by not leveraging the adversarial tools available. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a lawyer to first identify the client's potential frame of reference regarding legal systems. Then, the lawyer must prioritize educating the client about the specific procedural and ethical landscape of the jurisdiction where the case is being handled, in this instance, Alabama. This involves a clear, concise explanation of the adversarial system's mechanics, the lawyer's role, and the client's rights and responsibilities within that system. The goal is to ensure the client can make informed decisions and actively participate in their legal matter, thereby upholding the lawyer's duty of competence and diligence under Alabama law. Question 15. Compliance review shows that a financial advisor in Alabama is meeting with a client who expresses that their financial decisions are guided by principles derived from canon law. The advisor needs to determine the most appropriate way to proceed with financial planning. Option A. Advise the client that canon law is not relevant to financial planning and focus solely on standard financial metrics. Option B. Offer to provide interpretations of canon law as it applies to financial matters, based on the advisor's understanding. Option C. Suggest that the client must align their financial goals strictly with what the advisor believes canon law dictates. Option D. Inquire respectfully about how these principles might influence their financial goals, risk tolerance, or investment preferences, and integrate this understanding into the financial plan. The correct answer is D. Inquire respectfully about how these principles might influence their financial goals, risk tolerance, or investment preferences, and integrate this understanding into the financial plan. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor in Alabama to navigate the potential influence of canon law on a client's financial decisions, particularly when those decisions intersect with religious principles. The advisor must balance their professional duty to act in the client's best financial interest with an understanding of how deeply held religious beliefs, potentially informed by canon law, might shape those interests. This requires sensitivity, ethical awareness, and a clear understanding of the advisor's scope of practice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves acknowledging the client's stated religious convictions and their potential connection to canon law, without assuming expertise in canon law itself. The advisor should gently inquire about how these principles might influence their financial goals or risk tolerance. This approach respects the client's autonomy and values, allowing the advisor to tailor advice to the client's unique circumstances. The advisor's role is to facilitate informed financial decisions based on the client's stated objectives, which may be influenced by their faith. This aligns with ethical principles of client-centered advice and fiduciary duty, ensuring that the advisor acts in the client's best interest as defined by the client. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's mention of canon law as irrelevant to financial planning. This fails to acknowledge the client's deeply held beliefs and the potential impact they have on their financial decision-making. It demonstrates a lack of empathy and can alienate the client, leading to advice that is not truly in their best interest because it ignores a significant personal factor. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to provide definitive interpretations or advice based on canon law. Financial advisors are not trained or licensed to interpret religious law. Offering such interpretations would be outside the scope of their professional competence and could lead to misinformed decisions for the client, potentially causing financial harm or spiritual distress. This also oversteps professional boundaries. A further incorrect approach is to impose the advisor's own interpretation of religious principles or canon law onto the client's financial situation. This is a violation of client autonomy and professional ethics, as it prioritizes the advisor's personal beliefs over the client's stated needs and values. It can lead to biased advice and a breakdown of trust. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centered approach that prioritizes understanding the client's holistic needs, including their values and beliefs. When a client introduces a factor like canon law, the professional should approach it with curiosity and respect, seeking clarification on its relevance to the client's stated goals. The professional must then integrate this understanding into their advice while remaining within their area of expertise. If the client's beliefs introduce complexities that the advisor cannot adequately address, the ethical course of action is to refer the client to a qualified professional who can provide guidance on those specific matters, such as a religious advisor or legal counsel specializing in ecclesiastical law, if appropriate. Question 16. Compliance review shows that an investment advisory firm operating in Alabama has a standard client agreement that does not explicitly use the term fiduciary, but outlines services related to portfolio management and financial planning. Firm's internal policy suggests that their duty to clients is limited to what is expressly stated in the agreement, and that general disclaimers of liability are sufficient to mitigate any broader obligations. Which of the following best reflects the definition and characteristics of a fiduciary duty as it applies to this investment advisory firm in Alabama? Option A. The firm's fiduciary obligations are limited to what is expressly stated in the client agreement, and general disclaimers are effective in waiving any broader duties. Option B. The fiduciary duty is only triggered if the client agreement explicitly uses the term fiduciary and grants the advisor direct control over client assets. Option C. The firm, by virtue of providing investment advisory services in Alabama, inherently assumes a fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, requiring loyalty, care, and full disclosure of conflicts, regardless of explicit contractual language or general disclaimers. Option D. A fiduciary duty is a contractual obligation that can be entirely disclaimed through standard contractual clauses, as long as the client signs the agreement. The correct answer is C. The firm, by virtue of providing investment advisory services in Alabama, inherently assumes a fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, requiring loyalty, care, and full disclosure of conflicts, regardless of explicit contractual language or general disclaimers. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of the definition and characteristics of a fiduciary duty under Alabama law, specifically in the context of investment advisory services. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a general business relationship and one that imposes a higher standard of care. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's regulatory framework governing investment advisors. The best professional practice involves recognizing that an investment advisor in Alabama, by virtue of their role and the services provided, inherently assumes a fiduciary duty towards their clients. This duty mandates acting solely in the client's best interest, prioritizing their needs above the advisor's own. This includes a duty of loyalty, care, and good faith, requiring full disclosure of any conflicts of interest and the provision of advice that is suitable and beneficial to the client. This approach aligns with the principles established in Alabama law and the ethical standards expected of investment professionals operating within the state. An approach that suggests the fiduciary duty is only triggered by explicit contractual language is incorrect. While contracts can reinforce fiduciary obligations, the duty arises from the nature of the relationship itself, particularly when one party entrusts another with financial management and advice. Alabama law, like general principles of fiduciary law, recognizes that the power and influence inherent in an advisory role create an obligation to act with utmost good faith, regardless of whether the word fiduciary is explicitly stated in a contract. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a fiduciary duty is limited to situations involving direct management of client assets. This is a flawed perspective because fiduciary duties extend to all aspects of the advisory relationship, including providing investment recommendations, financial planning, and any advice that influences a client's financial decisions. The scope of the duty is determined by the nature of the services offered and the client's reliance on the advisor's expertise, not solely by the physical control of assets. Finally, an approach that posits that a fiduciary duty is a mere formality that can be disclaimed through general disclaimers is also professionally unacceptable. Alabama law, and indeed federal securities law, generally prohibits the disclaimer of fiduciary duties. Such attempts are often deemed void as against public policy, as they undermine the fundamental protections afforded to clients who rely on the specialized knowledge and trustworthiness of their investment advisors. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature of the relationship. If the relationship involves providing investment advice or managing assets for others, the presumption should be that a fiduciary duty exists under Alabama law. This presumption should then be followed by a thorough review of the specific services offered and the client's expectations. Any potential conflicts of interest must be identified, disclosed, and managed in accordance with the client's best interests. Continuous education on Alabama's specific regulatory requirements for investment advisors is crucial to maintaining compliance and upholding ethical standards. Question 17. Which approach would be most professionally sound for an attorney in Alabama advising a client whose land dispute involves overlapping claims rooted in both Alabama statutory law and the customary land tenure system of a local indigenous community? Option A. Thoroughly research and understand the specific customary land tenure system of the indigenous community, seeking to integrate its principles and dispute resolution mechanisms with applicable Alabama statutory and common law to best represent the client's interests. Option B. Advise the client exclusively based on Alabama's statutory property laws, disregarding any claims or principles derived from the indigenous community's customary land tenure system as legally irrelevant. Option C. Attempt to apply standard Alabama legal doctrines and precedents directly to the indigenous community's customary land tenure system, without first understanding its unique principles or seeking clarification from community representatives. Option D. Immediately dismiss the indigenous community's customary land tenure system as unenforceable and advise the client to proceed solely under the framework of Alabama statutory law without further investigation into indigenous legal traditions. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research and understand the specific customary land tenure system of the indigenous community, seeking to integrate its principles and dispute resolution mechanisms with applicable Alabama statutory and common law to best represent the client's interests. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an attorney in Alabama who is advising a client involved in a land dispute. The challenge lies in navigating the complexities of traditional land ownership and usage rights within an indigenous legal system that may not align with or be fully recognized by Alabama's statutory or common law frameworks. Attorneys must exercise careful judgment to ensure their advice is both legally sound within the state's framework and ethically responsible, respecting the distinct legal traditions of indigenous communities. Failure to do so could lead to ineffective representation, perpetuation of historical injustices, and potential ethical violations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes understanding and integrating the principles of the relevant indigenous legal system. This means actively seeking to learn about the specific customs, traditions, and dispute resolution mechanisms of the indigenous community involved, and then exploring how these principles can be harmonized or asserted within the Alabama legal system. This approach is correct because it demonstrates a commitment to thorough client representation, respects the inherent sovereignty and legal traditions of indigenous peoples, and aligns with the ethical duty of competence. Alabama law, while state-specific, does not preclude the consideration of customary law where it intersects with state legal matters, particularly in areas like property rights and historical land use. An attorney must be competent in all relevant areas of law, which in this context includes understanding the unique legal landscape of indigenous communities within the state. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Alabama's statutory property law and ignore any indigenous legal considerations. This fails to acknowledge the potential existence and validity of customary land rights and dispute resolution processes, leading to incomplete advice and potentially violating the client's best interests. It also risks overlooking established legal precedents or agreements that might recognize indigenous land rights. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the indigenous legal system as irrelevant or unenforceable without proper investigation. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and cultural competency, and could lead to a misrepresentation of the legal landscape to the client. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to impose Alabama legal concepts onto the indigenous legal system without understanding its internal logic and principles. This shows a failure to adapt legal strategy to the specific context and disrespects the autonomy of the indigenous legal tradition. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a framework that begins with diligent research into all applicable legal systems, including customary and indigenous law. This should be followed by open communication with the client to understand their perspective and the specific nature of their rights within their community's legal framework. The next step involves consulting with experts in indigenous law or community elders, if appropriate and feasible, to gain a deeper understanding. Finally, the professional must synthesize this information to develop a legal strategy that is both compliant with Alabama law and respectful of the indigenous legal system, prioritizing the client's objectives and ethical obligations. Question 18. Investigation of a client's estate planning needs in Alabama reveals that they wish to structure their will in accordance with specific principles of Islamic law, Sharia, particularly concerning the distribution of assets and the role of beneficiaries. The client expresses concern that traditional Alabama inheritance laws might not adequately reflect their religious obligations. What is the most appropriate course of action for an Alabama licensed legal professional to take? Option A. Advise the client to draft their will solely based on their interpretation of Sharia, without regard for Alabama's statutory inheritance laws, assuming that religious directives will supersede state law. Option B. Directly apply the general principles of Islamic inheritance as understood by the legal professional to the client's estate plan, without seeking detailed clarification from the client on their specific religious interpretations or consulting Alabama law. Option C. Inform the client that Alabama law governs all estate distributions, and that their religious beliefs regarding Sharia cannot be directly incorporated into a legally binding will. Option D. Ascertain the client's specific understanding and desired application of Islamic law principles relevant to their estate, and then research how these principles can be legally integrated or addressed within the framework of Alabama's probate and inheritance statutes, advising the client on legally permissible options. The correct answer is D. Ascertain the client's specific understanding and desired application of Islamic law principles relevant to their estate, and then research how these principles can be legally integrated or addressed within the framework of Alabama's probate and inheritance statutes, advising the client on legally permissible options. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for conflict between established Alabama legal principles and the client's deeply held religious beliefs derived from Islamic law. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of both legal systems and the ethical obligation to represent a client effectively while respecting their faith. The core difficulty lies in identifying how to integrate or reconcile Sharia principles with the practicalities of Alabama law, particularly when those principles might diverge from secular legal norms. The best professional approach involves a thorough and respectful exploration of how Islamic law principles might inform or intersect with the client's legal objectives within the framework of Alabama law. This means understanding the client's specific interpretation and application of Sharia relevant to their situation, and then researching how those principles can be legally accommodated or addressed under Alabama statutes and case law. This approach prioritizes client autonomy and religious freedom while remaining firmly grounded in the governing legal jurisdiction. It acknowledges that while Sharia is not a direct source of law in Alabama, its principles can influence a client's decisions and require careful consideration in legal strategy. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's reliance on Islamic law outright, asserting that only Alabama law is relevant. This fails to acknowledge the client's fundamental rights and can lead to a breakdown in trust and ineffective representation. It ignores the potential for creative legal solutions that respect the client's faith. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to directly apply Sharia principles as if they were binding Alabama law, without regard for the state's statutory and common law. This would be a misrepresentation of the legal landscape and could lead to detrimental legal outcomes for the client. Finally, an approach that misinterprets or superficially addresses the client's understanding of Islamic law without seeking clarification or expert input if necessary would also be professionally deficient. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and respect for the client's religious convictions. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with active listening and a commitment to understanding the client's perspective, including their religious framework. This should be followed by diligent research into both the client's stated principles and the applicable Alabama legal framework. Where potential conflicts or intersections arise, professionals should explore all legally permissible avenues to accommodate the client's beliefs, consulting with legal scholars or religious advisors if necessary, and with the client's consent. The ultimate goal is to achieve the client's objectives within the bounds of Alabama law in a manner that is ethically sound and respectful of their faith. Question 19. Assessment of an attorney's approach to advising a client on a complex property dispute within the state of Alabama, considering the role of codified law and judicial interpretation. Option A. Consult the property laws of a neighboring state, such as Mississippi, as a primary source for resolving the Alabama property dispute, believing their legal frameworks are likely similar. Option B. Primarily rely on general principles of common law property rights, assuming they are universally applicable and supersede any specific statutory provisions in Alabama. Option C. Thoroughly research and apply the specific provisions of the Alabama Code relevant to the property dispute, using Alabama case law to interpret and clarify the application of these statutes to the client's facts. Option D. Assume the Alabama Code is exhaustive and contains precise answers for every property dispute. Therefore, no further research into judicial interpretations is necessary. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research and apply the specific provisions of the Alabama Code relevant to the property dispute, using Alabama case law to interpret and clarify the application of these statutes to the client's facts. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an attorney in Alabama who is tasked with advising a client on a complex property dispute. The challenge lies in navigating the interplay between Alabama's codified law and the potential for common law principles to influence interpretation or fill gaps. Attorneys must demonstrate a deep understanding of how Alabama's statutory framework, particularly its codified laws, is the primary source of legal authority, while also recognizing that judicial precedent, rooted in common law traditions, plays a crucial role in interpreting and applying those codes. Misinterpreting the hierarchy or the application of these sources can lead to incorrect legal advice, potentially harming the client's interests and exposing the attorney to professional liability. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves prioritizing the direct application and interpretation of the relevant Alabama Code provisions. This means thoroughly researching the specific statutes governing property disputes in Alabama, analyzing their language, and understanding how Alabama courts have interpreted these statutes in prior decisions. The Alabama Code is a systematic compilation of the state's statutory laws, and its provisions are intended to be the definitive statement of the law in those areas. Therefore, the primary duty of an attorney is to ascertain and apply the law as written in the code, supplemented by relevant case law that clarifies the meaning and application of those statutes. This approach ensures adherence to the codified legal framework established by the Alabama legislature. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on general principles of common law property rights without first exhaustively examining the Alabama Code. While common law may inform the development of statutory law, Alabama's codified statutes are the supreme law of the state in their respective domains. Ignoring or downplaying the specific language and intent of the Alabama Code in favor of abstract common law principles would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it deviates from the established statutory authority. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that the Alabama Code is exhaustive and contains specific provisions for every conceivable property dispute, neglecting the role of judicial interpretation. While codification aims for comprehensiveness, statutes are often general, and their application to specific factual scenarios requires judicial interpretation. Failing to consider relevant Alabama case law that interprets and applies the relevant statutes would lead to an incomplete and potentially flawed legal analysis. A further incorrect approach would be to consult the statutes of another state or federal law as the primary authority for an Alabama property dispute. Alabama's legal system operates under its own constitution and legislative enactments, applying laws from other jurisdictions without a clear understanding of their limited applicability or specific adoption into Alabama law would be a fundamental error, violating the attorney's duty to provide advice based on the governing jurisdiction's laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a hierarchical approach to legal research and analysis. First, identify the governing jurisdiction, Alabama. Second, thoroughly research the Alabama Code for relevant statutes. Third, examine Alabama case law that interprets and applies those statutes. Fourth, if gaps or ambiguities exist in the codified law, consider persuasive authority from other jurisdictions or established legal principles, but always with the understanding that Alabama statutory and case law are paramount. This systematic process ensures that advice is grounded in the specific legal framework of Alabama, fulfilling the attorney's ethical obligations to the client and the court. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that an Alabama attorney is advising a client on a complex property dispute involving a novel interpretation of a state environmental regulation. The attorney finds a highly respected law review article from a prominent Alabama legal scholar that argues for an interpretation of the regulation that would significantly benefit the client. However, there is no direct Alabama case law on point, and the statutory language itself is somewhat ambiguous. The attorney needs to estimate the potential legal costs associated with pursuing this novel interpretation, which will depend on the likelihood of success. If the attorney estimates the probability of success based on the scholar's interpretation as \P\, and the total estimated legal fees are \F\, what is the expected legal cost if the attorney proceeds with this interpretation? Option A \P times F \, Option B \F/P \, Option C \F plus P \, Option D \F times 1P \. The correct answer is A, \P times F \. Explanation. Benchmark analysis indicates that the role of doctrine and legal scholarship in Alabama jurisprudence presents a professionally challenging scenario requiring careful judgment. Specifically, determining the weight to be given to scholarly interpretations versus established statutory or case law when advising a client on a novel legal issue necessitates a nuanced understanding of how Alabama courts engage with persuasive authority. The challenge lies in balancing the potential persuasive power of well-reasoned academic arguments with the binding authority of primary legal sources. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of the relevant Alabama statutes and controlling case law first. If the existing law is clear and directly addresses the client's situation, then scholarly commentary, while potentially insightful, should not override the established legal precedent. However, if the statutes are ambiguous, or if there is a lack of direct case law on point, then legal scholarship can play a crucial role in informing the interpretation of the law. This approach is correct because Alabama courts, like most common law jurisdictions, prioritize statutory interpretation and stare decisis. Doctrine and legal scholarship are considered persuasive authority, meaning they can influence judicial decisions, but do not bind them unless adopted by the court. Therefore, a lawyer's primary duty is to the existing, binding law of Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a prominent legal scholar's interpretation of a statute, even if that interpretation appears logical, without first verifying if it aligns with existing Alabama statutes and case law. This fails to acknowledge the hierarchy of legal authority in Alabama, where statutes and binding judicial decisions hold precedence over academic commentary. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss all legal scholarship as irrelevant, even in situations where Alabama law is unclear or underdeveloped. This overlooks the valuable role that well-reasoned scholarship can play in guiding judicial interpretation and developing new legal principles, potentially leading to a less robust or less persuasive legal argument for the client. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the governing legal framework, Alabama statutes, and case law. Next, they should assess whether the existing law clearly resolves the client's issue. If it does, the analysis should focus on applying that law. If the law is unclear or silent, then the professional should research relevant legal scholarship, critically evaluating its arguments and considering how they might persuade an Alabama court to interpret or extend existing law. The ultimate goal is to provide advice grounded in the most authoritative legal sources available, supplemented by persuasive scholarship where appropriate.